So if you were to advise the Greek government, the European Union, and the IMF, what advice would you give all three groups?
God, I mean, that's a horrible question. Because
that's why we saved it for you.
No, because we're not ready for a deal yet. It's not yet time for advice. We still have several weeks. We still have the ability of both sides to make it seem like it's more urgent, like there's more of a crisis. If you're Mr. Tsipras right now, the Prime Minister of Greece, you can't cut a deal when you still have a couple weeks, when there still isn't super pressure. You absolutely need to have the German government, press you as hard against the wall as humanly possible, the IMF as well, so that when you finally do capitulate, everyone back in Greece understands that you've given as good as you possibly can. Otherwise, it's going to be.
So this is all for show. This is a show experience rather than anything constructive, because they're not talking about specific things like overhauling the pension system. They're not talking about overhauling the tax collection system. They're not talking about privatizing various state-owned assets. This is all a negotiating experience rather than a substantive conversation about the details of figuring out how to help the Greek economy.
There has been substantive conversations, and I think that's why you saw more optimism from the German side, including the finance minister last week, specifically on labor reforms and specifically on the fiscal outlook, sustainability for Greece. You haven't seen it on pension reform yet.
But didn't the Greek Supreme Court come out and say just recently that they can't go ahead and do this, that this would be against the law?
On some of it. But again, the IMF today, the reason you're seeing all the headlines today and the markets go crazy is because the IMF has stormed off and said we're still very far apart. Again, you're going to see negotiation on both sides right up until the wire. It's going to be hard, and the deal is only going to last them for a few months.
How key is... Obviously, the IMF has a very key role in this particular situation, but lately we've seen the IMF giving advice to a lot of governments and government bodies, including the Fed. Do you think that the IMF should have such a strong role, or does it need to be reduced?
I like the IMF having a strong role in the sense that I believe that they are very technocratic in orientation. They're strategic. They're long-term. They're not worried about sort of the next electoral cycle. When they're providing advice to international governments, the ability to follow through on implementation and assure that those governments are actually going to adhere to policies after a deal is constructed, that's a very different story. So if you're asking me, has all IMF money over the long term been spent in ways that have led to sustainable development, the answer is no. If you ask me, do I think that the folks at the IMF, the senior leadership of the IMF, are some of the smartest technocratic economists that we have in the world and people we generally want to listen to? The answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah, but they don't compete in elections. They're not politicians. They don't have to answer to an electorate.
But isn't that better?
That's good.
Well, it's just real.
That's better. I mean, I think...
It's not a question of whether it's better or worse. It's a question of what's real and what's not real.
Well, you're asking where you want advice to come from. I think advice generally should come from people that don't have to be beholden to their electorate and therefore tend to lie to you about hearing things you want to tell them as opposed to things that they think are actually true. It's one of the reasons people are so disillusioned in this country with the American political system.
Does Tsipras still feel as much pressure from the left, or has he, to some extent, lost that support already, now freeing him to make more of a centrist deal?
That's why this is still so dicey, is that he still feels like he has pressure from the Germans and from the Europeans and the IMF, but he also has to ensure that he doesn't have so many defections when he finally cuts a deal that he no longer has the ability to govern. He doesn't want a minority government. That's going to be very short-lasting, and the place will fall apart.
And the deal will fall apart.
And the deal will fall apart.
Right.
So this is not an easy position. The biggest mistake that Tsipras has made, in my view, is not the way he's been so difficult and obstreperous with the Europeans. It's been some of the people he's appointed who have been freelancing. It's Varoufakis, the finance minister, who in my view is incredibly smart, but really doesn't have the experience and isn't a team player. I mean, he's not actually...
Well, and Schäuble's made comments to that extent. He doesn't think that these guys really are up to it, and that could be a bummer for Greece. So what do you think about Tsipras?
Look, I was clearly, when Syriza won, sort of with a near majority, I mean, these are people that have never governed before. They're not really in coalition. The independent Greeks are hardly a coalition partner. And so you do have to worry that everyone in the Greek government today are people that have had no experience actually working with the Europeans as interlocutors. So that means that if Varoufakis is a hothead and if the meeting goes badly, you don't have a number 2 or number 3 behind him that can then call the Germans and say, look, this is what we really think. You don't have anything that can actually grease the wheels when things get stuck.
That's because the previous politicians were greasing the wheels a little too much.
A little too much, and the Germans were facilitating that for a very long time. Let's not just blame the Greeks. I do think that there is this narrative in the West that the Greeks are shiftless and that no one facilitated it, kind of like in 2008, that the banks were all fine, and it was just these horrible people that were taking mortgages they could never pay for. That's not a reasonable expectation.
Now,
right?
you talked about roles before, the roles that these different institutions play, and the focus of your new book, Superpower, talks about the role of the United States, and you say that we have 3 choices, right? The United States can remain a superpower, do everything everywhere.
Interventionist.
But there are also 2 other potential roles for the United States. Explain what the choices are.
Well, I think we are the only superpower, irrespective of one of the 3 choices we take, but they're very different. Indispensable is the notion that if we don't lead, no one else will, and therefore we have to actually support alliances, support big institutions like NATO and the IMF, and also support our values. Moneyball, the idea that's not sentimental, stop with the promotion of values. If the Europeans don't want to pay for NATO, then NATO's going to matter less. Take big bets in the places that really matter to us. Independent America, the notion that the first 2 ideas are great, but if we're not really going to pay for it, stop lying to people and instead focus much more on the United States. We're going to talk about this in the 2016 election a lot, and we already see candidates coming out with each of those perspectives.